Well, hello, ladies and gents. Robert Sykes, KetoSavage.com, and in today's Ask Me Anything, we're going to be discussing if you need to eat dietary fat, added dietary fat, if your primary goal is to lose body fat. But first, let's roll the intro. All right, I am back. I am Robert Sykes, lifetime natural competitive bodybuilder, and I'm here to answer all of your ketogenic performance questions. Today's question is brought to us by Bonita, and she asks, when you are trying to lose weight eating a ketogenic diet, do you limit the amount of added fat that you consume, i.e. butter and MCT oils, to coffee and only consume the fat that is naturally found in the meats, dairy, and other foods that you consume? I've been told that if you have fat on your body to lose, then you do not need to consume added fats, as this will cause you to not lose the weight. Thank you for your help, Robert. Thank you for your question. So I get this question a lot, and I've been thinking about how I want to tackle this question and break it down in the most informative and understandable way that's not going to go too deep into the weeds, but really effectively answer this question. So it makes a lot of intuitive sense why one would think that if you're trying to lose body fat, then you shouldn't consume a bunch of dietary fat, because if you have body fat to lose and you're keto adapted, it makes sense that your body would be able to tap into its stored body fat for fuel and not necessarily consume it exogenously through the foods that you eat. That makes a lot of intuitive sense. It makes sense why people would think that way. However, I disagree, and here's why. So let's try and control for as many variables as possible. Let's assume that you're in a caloric deficit, which you would ideally want to be in if your primary objective is losing body fat. So let's assume you're in a caloric deficit, and let's assume that calories are equated for whether you're trying to keep protein relatively high relative to other macronutrients or dietary fat high relative to other macronutrients. So you basically have two options. If you're on a ketogenic diet, you're not eating carbohydrates, so we'll just assume that those are very low, and we'll basically remove those from the equation in the context of this question. So you can either leave your protein relatively high and be deriving most of your nutrients from protein, or you can be leaving your dietary fat high and derive the majority of your energy and nutrients from that. You want to make sure you've got adequate protein, even in the context of a caloric deficit. You don't want to be malnourished, so I would recommend having protein at a moderate intake. Now, if calories are equated for, let me try and throw some numbers here at you. If you have got 2,000 calories coming in, and that's a deficit for you, and you're trying to prioritize losing body fat, and you've got 2,000 calories to work with, you can basically leave the majority of those calories coming from protein and not consume that much dietary fat because you're trying to keep your body using its stored fat, or you can have the vast majority of those 2,000 calories coming from dietary fat. And if the calories are equated for, your body is going to lose body fat if you're in the context of a deficit. And there's a whole lot of other nuance here with regard to hormones, metabolism, but I'm not going to go into that for the context of answering this question. So you basically have to decide if you're going to function and perform better and have a more effective drop in stored body fat if you're opting for protein or fat as your primary fuel source, getting those energies from those calories. So when it comes to being in a caloric deficit, you're going to have a waning energy source in the first place because you don't have an abundance of fuel coming in. You're in a deficit. So you can either opt to derive a lot of your energy from protein, and that's a process through gluconeogenesis. Protein is the building blocks for muscle. And if you're in a caloric deficit and trying to lose body fat, building muscle is not your primary objective. You want to maintain the muscle you have, maintain the muscle you've built, and being in a ketogenic state is very anti-catabolic. So you don't really have to worry about losing that much muscle. But building muscle is not your primary objective. So you don't have to worry about having a surplus of protein. So as long as you have adequate protein on either side of the equation, you're good to go. A lot of people argue that if you have high protein and low dietary fat, then you're going to be in a heightened state of body fat burning because of the thermic effect of food of protein. So protein has about a 20% higher thermic effect of food compared to carbohydrates and dietary fat. Rough numbers, but about 20%. And that basically means that it requires more energy for your body to break down and assimilate that protein than other macronutrients. So a lot of people argue that, okay, if you're eating more protein then and you're burning more calories just by the consumption of that macronutrient, then that would bode well for losing body fat. And you couple that with the argument that if you're trying to lose body fat, then let your body tap into its own stored body fat and not consume it through dietary means. That's the primary argument in favor of not having that much additional fat coming into your diet if your primary goal is to lose body fat. This is my argument. It's pretty much the exact opposite. So if you're in a caloric deficit and energy is waning and you're keto adapted, you're getting your vast majority of your energy from fats. That's where you're getting your fuel. And yes, you can get fuel from your stored body fat, but if you're not really fully adapted or if you're not tapping into that very efficiently, then you don't necessarily want to be opting for gluconeogenesis and protein for your primary energy source, because that's just an inefficient process to begin with. Taking in a bunch of protein, having gluconeogenesis, is going to result in higher blood glucose numbers, lower ketones, and just less overall energy. My mental clarity and my overall physical energy goes down the tubes when my protein is much, much higher relative to my fat in the context of a caloric deficit. However, if you're very deeply keto adapted and you're very efficient at using fat, whether it be stored body fat, adipose tissue, or dietary fat for energy, then you're going to be able to tap into that for fuel. And if you're in a caloric deficit and you need to have that energy to maintain your training and really, progress with your weight loss journey, then having enough dietary fat helps, because then you're going to have more energy. It's easier to tap into, especially in this, being in a ketogenic state. And if you're having an influx of dietary fat, like say 70 to 80% of your calories are coming from dietary fat, that's the majority of your caloric consumption, your body is going to get really, really good at learning how to use that to power its day-to-day functions. The more efficient it gets at using that fat, the easier it's going to be to tap into your stored body fat as well. And if calories are equated for, both with the higher protein and the higher fat, if those are dropping, then you're going to be more efficient and have more energy in the context of the vast majority of your calories coming from fat relative to protein. Now, again, I want to stress the point that you want to make sure you're taking an adequate protein, and that's going to be different for every individual. That's going to be dependent upon your age, your amount of lean muscle tissue, a lot of different factors at play there. But when it comes to losing body fat, prioritizing the loss of stored adipose tissue, then I opt, and I recommend you opt, for a higher dietary fat intake, calories equated for, in which case your body's going to become more streamlined, more efficient at using fat overall, whether it's coming from the plate or from your body. Your body's going to become more efficient at using fat for fuel. And then the more efficient it becomes at doing that, the more efficient it's going to become at tapping into your stored body fats. And you're going to have a surplus and an abundance of energy, even in the context of a caloric deficit. And the more energy you have, the better your training is going to be, the better your day-to-day activity is going to be, and it's going to make being in a caloric deficit more sustainable and more enjoyable, and you'll be less likely to binge, go off the rails, and eat, outside of your nutritional protocol, and then hinder your ability to lose that body fat. So having the higher body fats, or having the higher dietary fat ratio in the context of a caloric deficit for optimizing for fat loss makes it more sustainable, gives you more energy, increases the efficiency of your body's ability to use fat, and just optimizes for fat loss as being the primary objective. So in this situation, I would definitely recommend continuing to have that plate fat, that dietary fat. Again, you have to make sure that your calories are controlled for. A lot of people their goal is to lose body fat, but they're just eating unnecessary amounts of caloric, intake and dietary fat, because they think that just being in a state of ketosis is going to cause them to miraculously lose weight. That's not the case. If calories are equated for, then I argue that having the higher fat ratio is optimal. But again, calories being equated for. So there's my take on that. Hopefully that answers your question. Thank you for submitting that question. Again, if you submit a question and we use it on this A.M.A. video series, then you get a supply of keto bricks shipped to you. You requested peanut butter bonitas, so we are sending some peanut butter bricks your way. Thanks again, and thank y'all. I'll be in touch.